So continuing with our progression on solving any type of equation, we're moving on from our one-step equations to solving two-step equations. Now, there's a couple things that we need to keep in mind, and this is where the value of understanding order of operations is really going to become helpful to us, because we're actually going to use order of operations. We're going to use order of operations, but in reverse. So we're going to think about reverse GEMDAS when we go about solving these equations. So if I think about my GEMDAS hopscotch board over here, I'm just going to draw it real quick. We know that the top is our groupings, followed underneath that by our exponents. And then we have multiply and divide, and add and subtract. Now keep in mind that when we deal with multiplying and dividing, we have that rule of moving left to right if I see both. And likewise, if I see adding and subtracting, we have that rule of moving left to right. There's going to be less of an issue with thinking about order of operations or reverse order of operations because we're usually only going to see one or the other, but not both, but it's still a good review. So when I think about using order of operations for solving equations, though, I'm going to think about going in reverse. So that means I'm going to go from the bottom back up. The way I'm going to solve an equation is starting down here, identifying which of the operations I might have, and using their inverses. So for example, when I look at this first equation, 6n minus 11, I see that I have multiplying and I have subtraction. I have multiplying 6 times n, and I have subtraction minus 11. When I look at those two operations over at my board, I realize the subtraction is the one that's closer to the bottom or is at the bottom. So that's the first operation I will undo with the reverse of order of operations by using the inverse operations. So my first step in this, working from the ground up, so to speak, will be to undo the subtraction with its inverse of addition, or more specifically, to undo the subtracting of 11 by adding 11 on both sides. Now, what that's going to accomplish is you should be able to see naturally is that the 11s will cancel, and it will leave me the 6n isolated. 6n is going to get isolated or all by itself. That variable term is going to be isolated or wind up all by itself on one side of the equation, away from what we call the non-variable term, or more specifically the constant. And that constant is going to be the result of 31 plus 11, which is 42. So you should notice from here that we are now essentially at a one-step equation. So we started with two steps, having to undo subtraction, followed by having to undo multiplication, by first using the inverse of subtraction, think round up, by adding 11. And now we're going to move on to this step of solving the one-step equation. So we've done this. This is what we've been working on in the last day or two. So we're going to undo the multiplying, you see, the next step up in our reverse order of operations with its inverse of dividing. So I'm going to undo the multiplying by 6 by dividing 6 on both sides. That's going to cause my 6 to cancel, and that's going to give me n is equal to, well, 42 divided by 6. Hopefully with our multiplication rules, we know that 6 times 7 is 42. So 42 divided by 6 is 7. And that should be our answer. If I want to do a check, well, my check would have to be done by taking the 6, not times n anymore, times 7, subtracting 11 from it, and seeing if it equals 31. So I'm actually just going to, this is my check over here. Okay, so this is where now I use my order of operations from the top down. So 6 times 7, there's my 42, minus 11. Does that equal 31? 42 minus 11, 31, equals 31. There's my check. So my answer I'm happy with. So I like to put a finishing touch of putting a circle around it. So I'm all set. So that in a nutshell is how we solve two-step equations. So we're going to think ground up from the bottom up with GEMDAS, undoing operations from the ground up with inverse operations. And that first step of adding or subtracting, the inverse of the bottom level of GEMDAS, is typically going to get us to the variable term being isolated, being all alone, which then gives us a one-step equation, which we can move on to solving with the inverse operation of either multiplying or dividing. So that's where we're going to go with this. So instead of working across on our notes, I'm actually going to have us work down. We're going to get at least one more of these equations done, and then you will likely be on your own for solving the rest from there. Okay, so we've got one that we've already done. Let's move on to the next one. So step one, use inverse operations from the bottom up and undo the addition, in this case, by subtraction. So I'm undoing adding by subtracting. If I'm going to undo adding 7, I'm going to undo it by subtracting 7. Well, that takes care of the easy part. The 7's cancel out, and I get t over 4 is equal to, I'm going to clean that up a little bit because it looks like to me it's a big 7, is equal to whatever negative 2 minus 7 is. So, oh, hold on, I don't like this. So I'm going to do a quick KCO, because that looks like negative 2 minus 7, which turns into negative 2 plus negative 7. If you need the scoreboard, there's the negative, there's the positive, there's the 2, there's the 7. I know I'm rushing through this. Oh, it's negative because they're both on the same side. Negative 9. Good. With all that, I was very careful about making sure I handled negative 2 minus 7 correctly. So step one is out of the way. That was isolating the variable by adding or subtracting. Now I'm ready to move on to solving. So to solve, I have to undo this division. Don't forget, that's a division sign. That's a division sign. Okay, the fraction bar is like a division sign. So how do we undo dividing? We use the inverse of dividing, which is multiplying. If I'm dividing by 4 currently, I'll have to multiply by 4. Because it's an equation, and you'll hear me say this a lot, what you do to one side, multiplying by 4, you will do to the other side, multiplying by 4. My 4's are going to cancel, and that's going to get me fully reduced down to t equals. And now I just have to do 9 times 4. Oh, careful there. We have a negative times a positive. Don't lose the sign, negative. Let's see, negative 36 looks pretty confidently to be the right answer. Well, you know I'm not going to feel confident until I do a check. So I'm going to quickly do my check. Let's see, what's my value of t that I'm testing? Negative 36. I'm dividing it by 4, only to add 7 to see if I get a result of negative 2. All right, so let's work through this. Negative 36 divided by 4, I'm going to get negative. I'm going to get negative 9 plus 7. Does that equal negative 2? Well, if I think about the scoreboard, 9's on the left side, 7's on the right side. I'm adding. I'm going to subtract those values, but keep the negative. I'm going to get negative 2 equals negative 2. Check. All right, our solution works out. We did our check. I'm happy with my answer. Finishing touch. T equals negative 36. So, as you go through, there's 4 more equations on this sheet. You realize that they all look very similar to the 2 that we worked through together. And you notice they all have a very similar pattern of using inverse operations, but using reverse GEMDAS. So we're undoing from the bottom of GEMDAS with inverse operations and then climbing the ladder from there. You notice that almost always, or at least for today's notes, always the first step is going to be to add or subtract, to undo the adding or subtracting that's at the bottom of GEMDAS, to get the variable term isolated. Isolate means to get alone, okay? By the time we're done, we'll wind up with a one-step equation like 6n equals 42, and we'll undo the operation, in this case multiplying with its inverse of dividing, and we'll get our answer. And we will then do a quick check, which the more comfortable you get, the more you'll just do this mentally in your head and the less you'll write it out. But for now, you're seeing that I am writing out my check. Okay, so that's what I expect for all of you in what's remaining. You will think reverse GEMDAS. You will isolate by adding or subtracting. You will move on to multiplying or dividing to solve for the variable. And then you will go back and do your check. So I expect to see all 4 steps when you come into class tomorrow and when we check your notes. So from here, you're on your own, and we'll see you in class tomorrow to check in.